Welcome everyone to Voices with Vervaeke. I'm joined again by my friend Nick Winkelman. If you remember last time, Nick and I had an amazing discussion about his work on the language of coaching and the role of enacted analogy in facilitating people coming into a more functional and appropriate relationship to their body and to their environment. And that was just amazing. And I invited Nick back. I'm going to assume, in fact, this is not going to be our terminal conversation. There's ongoing stuff happening here, but I've sensed in some of the things Nick said, there's been an implication at least, or maybe an implicature that that what he's doing with people could be more comprehensively transformative, and perhaps that's even happened with some of the people that he's been coaching. And then the sense that his work and the kind of transformations it afford might be deeply relevant to what I and others have been calling the meaning crisis. And so I'm really looking forward to this conversation, Nick. So welcome back. It's great to talk to you again.
Well, thank you, John. I mean, as we said, I'm humbled to be able to share some insights from my background. I think in our first chat, you gave me a platform to kind of share with your audience the things that I've been thinking about in my context. What I'm really excited about for this, as we discussed before jumping on, is you helping me unpack the utility of these ideas for a much broader audience and a broader impact, and what is broader and important as making meaning in one's life. And so I'm very excited for this conversation, and through your work, it's encouraged me to look at the application of language, analogy, and metaphor in very different contexts. So looking forward to
it. That's great. So, I mean, there's one sense in which, speaking as a cognitive scientist, there's, that people have been talking about this for a long time, in that we've been talking about enacted analogies and enacted metaphors within anthropology for a long time. And I know you're aware of this. And then, of course, where we talk about people talk about ritual behavior, and one thing that seems to be sort of a consent. I mean, there's lots of controversy, of course, but one of the things is there's something like enacted metaphor, enacted analogy going on, and there's all kinds of stuff with playing with perspective and playing with gesture, and I think we should talk about gesture more today, and that. Trying to afford transformation. I mean, if you've ever gone to church, it's this big, huge, arena where you're playing with all of this stuff. And it seems to be a universal that human beings seek out, well-honed, ritual practices in order to afford perhaps restoring a lost sense of meaning or enhancing an existing sense or transforming themselves. And it seems to me, and I use the word arena because it plays between those, that your work it has the potential to bridge between a world where there's lots of ritual behavior, the world of sports and athletics, and then what the anthropologists by and large have been investigating when they've been investigating things that have fallen under the Western term religion. Many cultures don't even have a word for that. They don't, right? Because the ritual behavior and the everyday metaphorical behavior and the sensory motor behavior and the gesture behavior and the narrative, all of those are woven together in most cultures. We've tended to analyze them apart. So I think that sets up very much, I don't like this word, and I know you probably find it a little bit challenging too, but we don't have a better word right now, so that's why I gave that bit of a preamble. But the word I want to use is spiritual. There seems to be a spiritual potential in your work, and I'd like to try and provoke you in the friendly Socratic sense of what is that potential, and like what's your thinking on it, and how's your thinking emerging and growing in reflection on that?
100%. This is. I'm not personally, nor would I suggest most are, I don't take any triggering from the word spiritual, nor do I think it's purely the province of of religion in a Western sense.
Right.
And I really like that you're, and others are trying to bring that word in and look at it maybe in the same way we look at a word like love, right? Or importance. It's a state of being, and one that we all pursue and seek. And so let me start there in terms of my view. And this is personally very important for me. And this conversation may shape up to be one of the most intimate I've ever had in a public forum, because as I've told you, I, so to speak, fell away from traditional religion, traditional Christianity many years ago. But I found myself every day that I was falling away from it in its absolute sense. I also felt myself grasping back for something, but I didn't know how to grasp back to it, because the form factor that it was being presented to me, in again, a traditional Judeo-Christian sense, betrayed some of my own beliefs. And so like, I'm trying to now come back, and I feel this discussion of spirituality in a lot of my work is bridging back to this. And so I just want to put that as my own preamble to my thinking here. And so when we talk about analogy, let me try to define it from my perspective. And by all means, John, jump in and provide your own definitions. But when I think of it and I talk about it kind of in a sporting context, I talk about it very simply between a comparison between things. And notably a comparison between something that is familiar and something that is less familiar, or something that is familiar and something that we would like to become familiar to us, something that we'd like to bring into our own ecosystem, so to speak. Conventionally, when we look at analogy and metaphor, they talk about that as the source and the target, right? The source is the thing and the target is what you're trying to apply it to. And somehow we're trying to take some element of the familiar thing, and we're trying to show how it's related to the unfamiliar thing, so that you can come to know the unfamiliar thing in some way similar to how you know the familiar thing. So let me give a very simple example. When my daughter, was young, there was a time where she came across different kind of sport balls for the first time. And so she, one day I present to her a soccer ball. I say, honey, this is a soccer ball. And she says, oh, kind of like a basketball. And so what she did there is she was able to see, okay, there's this roundness similarity, there's this lightness similarity, there's this sports similarity. And so we've used the word, metaphors almost, and tell me if I'm wrong here, like acceptation. I accept some of the similar things about this to this new thing so I can start to understand it. And in that way, we use analogy all the time in conversation as well as physically, and I'll get to that in a moment. And it's almost like this collaboration with former selves. And I've said this before with you, and I really like that as an idea. And that when we approach the precipice of something that is unknown, right, that challenges us, we really are limited, at least I believe we're limited to understand it in terms of things that we already have locked in, things that we're already familiar with. And so in that regard, analogy is kind of this ever crescendoing of insight, where we use the past to help us understand the present. And so that's one way I think we look at analogy, just principally being important for making meaning. We try to extract the substance of a past experience to help us understand and integrate a new experience. Now, the last thing I want to share here, as again, kind of maybe an overarching intro, is how do we do that from day one? It's not like we come into this world with all this memory and language and concepts on board. And that's where perception and kind of our sensory motor apparatus is pretty important for building up these reference points, these real reference points that, so to speak, give us meaning in how we can interact and evolve ourselves in a world. And so let's take, for example, within 1 hour, right? Within 1 hour, and this comes out of, How the Body Shapes the Mind, Sean Gallagher's work. Within 1 hour, a baby can imitate a parent. right? They can stick their tongue out,
Yeah.
they can smile,
Yeah.
right? So imitation at first is this ability to sample the world around us.
Mm-hmm.
We don't yet, I would imagine we don't yet understand its consequences, its importance, but we can imitate to understand it first. And almost if we imagine that starts to scaffold up to inevitably we put words and concepts and language on those things that we can imitate from a sensory motor perspective. And take that as play. What is play? Play is my ability to imitate, to act as if.
Right.
What is analogy? It's acting as if. The young child on Halloween wears the doctor's costume only to grow up to become the doctor. And so we use the word analogy, and we talk about how analogy and metaphor allows us to create this bridge to making meaning. I think early on, physical analogy, enacted analogy, to use your phrase, it allows us to sense, to perceive something in the world that we, for whatever reason, unbeknownst to us, we want. And we can act as if. We can play, we can imitate. That early on allows us to sample, allows us to empathize. And when we come into contact with an enacted experience that I would say gives us a positive emotional response, then we continue to pursue that path. Early on, I would say it is imitation, but inevitably that imitation, I think with each step down that path, transforms into a becoming. You become the thing that early on you were just acting as if. Right. And so maybe I can pause there, but I do see analogy at that level of importance, in imitation, in play. It's not just in language. It is in virtually everything we do.
I think that's very, very good. I like that. So let me make sure I'm understanding you. You're saying that, when we have this very high level, often in propositional language, discourse around metaphor, right? But you think, you're proposing that it is grounded in ability, probably at least initially to some degree innate. That's Gallagher's point, right? You don't have to teach the baby to imitate. In fact, how would you teach a baby to imitate, right? If the baby wasn't capable of some comprehensive capacity for imitation given to it by evolution, then you couldn't possibly teach it to imitate, right? And then the idea that that ability to imitate the world, potentially start to, and then internalize it in pretense. So Ryle makes a very good argument, which Gallagher picks up on, right? That way before we have mental imagery, we have imagination in the sense of pretense. The child isn't forming and children can't initially, right? Forming a mental image of being a dinosaur, but when they romp around the room and they're, right? They're nevertheless pretending to be a dinosaur. And that's a kind of imagination by imitation rather than imagination by imagery. And so that sets, if I understand you, that sets sort of deep into our fundamental cognitive grammar, a way in which we're enacting as if so that we can aspire to become.
Yes.
Did I get you correctly?
Yes. No, that was very articulate and exactly what I am observing in my own lived experience and what I have read. Yes.
Yeah. So I think the idea that below metaphor is a capacity for mimesis is really important. So I'm wondering if there's also, because you're also doing this, you're gesturing, right? The whole time through, and even like you circled back and you were doing all of this. And I'm wondering if there's also, and for me, I don't think these two things are necessarily completely distinct mechanisms, but there's a capacity also for something like internal mimesis, much more like acceptation, that the brain can take sensory motor behavior for manipulating the world and then use that for communicating to the others, right? We imitate each other's gestures almost immediately, like sticking out of the tongue, the baby, right? All that sort of eyes widen, my eyes widen, the baby's like all this stuff, and we're doing it all the time. It's where most of the nonverbal stuff is happening, and you're even doing it to yourself, because we know that not only is gesturing communicative, it's also cognitive. A lot of my thinking, this is not just ornamentation. The work of Golden Meadow and others is showing it's actually doing a lot of the work of my cognition, that so that these two are cooperating. And there's an interesting, something like a metaphor or like mimesis between the speech and the gesture. They're kind of imitating and mirroring each other, but they're also different from each other, the way you and I are mirroring each other, but different from each other, right? So
I personally believe these are all operating on the same neural hardware, and just some of the features are older than others.
Yeah.
We have to probably think that gesturing, nonverbal, right, communication, well preceded our ability to verbalize ourselves in an articulate fashion. And so again, I think Gallagher's work here is relevant, where he makes the strong distinction between our body schema and our body image. One seems to be more innate, older.
The schema.
The schema, yes, right. Exactly. And body image is exactly, for the listeners, what you think of there. It's our image. It's how we, in almost a third person way, think through and feel through and know about and are aware of our body. But ultimately, the body schema is the operating system. It's what we use to move around to grab the cup. And so it's based, again, on your sensory motor machinery. It's based on your proprioceptive ability, your ability to know about where the body is in space. Now, yes, our sense of our body depends on that hardware, but again, you think through your body when you grab a cup of water. You don't think about your body while you're grabbing a cup of water. Right. And that is built on the body schema. So even, and you're doing this, but when you talk about, hey, this thing grew. Well, literally, I take my hands and I physically allow the space within them to grow. I went from here to here. I show height as a change, knowing that in our Western culture, a vertical change is considered a positive. Whereas conversely, I would have said, I dropped, or I'm feeling low today. And I gesture that low, knowing that when we are closer to the ground, we are almost more infantile. We are less developed. We have regressed. It's considered a negative. And so in the same way that we have a metaphorical grammar verbally, we have a metaphorical grammar physically in our gestures. And oftentimes, and you're probably the same way, John, if I have an idea that I can't quite grasp, grasp, what will I do? I will move my hands almost tacitly. It's like that thing, and I'm doing this until it's almost like I'm trying to get the body schema, the sensory motor engine going, so that boom, my cognition can grasp again what I'm trying to say verbally in that regard. Or even sometimes you'll give some pieces verbally, but through your gestures alone, the person will be like, I know exactly what you're talking about. They can't think of it either, yet they're still smiling and nodding. And so, this is why people throw out, 95% of communication is nonverbal. Let's not get stuck on the percentage. The reality is there is a tremendous amount of meaning that is imparted in physical gesture. And by the very nature, it is metaphorical. Right? My gesture is not the literal meaning, right? It is movement that suggests something. And that's what metaphor is, And so insofar as we have gesture and verbalization of metaphor, I believe they operate on the same hardware to convey insight.
I think that's right. I think, So I like these ideas. You've got gesture, the body schema, you've got mimesis, the ability to mirror, but also the ability to identify, because your example of the child wearing the lab coat in Halloween and eventually becoming the doctor, they're constructing an identity, so there's an identification process going on there. So this is, I mean, this is fundamental machinery by which we're making ourselves in a very
Yes.
powerful way.
Yes.
So is that where you see the connection to spirituality? So like what, like why you like it is itself a metaphor, like
Yeah.
the breath, right?
Yeah.
The wind, right? Why use this term spirituality for this? I'm agreeing with you that it's right, it's resonant, but let's try and articulate and explicate it together.
So John, what I'd love to do, because I'm the neophyte in this conversation, for my own calibration, I'd love it if you would put some language to spirituality for you. How would you define it? You know, bring it into light so I can understand the way you look at it. I think that would be very helpful then in the way that I'm trying to pursue it.
Yes. So how I use the word spirituality is I use it to refer to those processes by which we acquire and develop, often aspirationally, our capacity for non-propositional meaning, such that we can overcome self-deception and cultivate wisdom. And that often involves us coming into deeper relationships with ourselves, with other people in the world. And those and aspects of those relationships often can't even be properly expressed in the propositional. They have an ineffable quality, but they nevertheless feel deeply right and real to us. That's what I mean by spirituality.
And so this is where I'm just going to start to touch on where I believe analogy, what we're talking about in my own journey, can start to get us to this concept of spirituality as you've defined it. I think it'd be interesting for a moment to discuss this idea of disembodiment and how we oftentimes can think of ourselves as separate from this world that we are trying to become fully engaged in such a way that we gain meaning and insight that we can't even put into words. And I read something quite interesting today, and it goes back to, again, the body schema, that so often when we're interacting with the world, I'm interacting with the cup, I'm interacting with the car, I'm interacting with my computer to interact with John, I'm interacting with the pen to write on the paper, that my experience is in this outcome of this world. It's not of myself in generating that outcome with the world. And so what it starts to do is it creates this separation, that you believe yourself is this experience of the outcome of this interaction. And it's somehow, right, traditionally we would have called that, and some people still do, the soul, right? That the soul is somehow separate from this machinery that houses the soul. But this is where, again, we attend, we think, we perceive through our body. Our body is a vessel for interacting with the world around us. And so it is not separate. It is the means by which. It is not separate. It is the means by which. And I just think that as a starting point is really important, that we glue experience, that we bring experience back to mind, body are one. They work together. They are constrained by each other. And as you say, rightly so, they are embedded in the physical environment around us. And so that as a starting point, I think is really important. I can't completely articulate why I think it is so important, but if we're going to start to understand meaning, then I think we have to glue ourselves back together. We can't have one thing floating separate from the other. They have to work together in this meaning-making process. And so when we now start to talk about spirituality and how analogy can help us, well, I think you used words around spirituality is this process of becoming. It almost suggests to me that it is a path. It is a pursuit. I am going towards something. Oftentimes, I'm going towards something that doesn't have a distinct ending. Maybe it doesn't have an ending. Maybe it shouldn't have an ending. And I'm not even quite sure what it is. It lacks the graspability oftentimes, yet there's something magnetizing me towards it. You know, for me in my life, a lot of the spirituality has evolved around the big existential questions. Why am I here? What is my purpose? For which there might not actually be a concrete answer. Hence the reason many of these things that we come to are ineffable, right? They're a feeling, they're an experience. Their clarity is in the experience of them, not your knowledge of them. Very different. And so how does analogy get us there? Well, let's go back. Let's go back to the kid that put on the Halloween costume. When he put on that Halloween costume, he would have had no idea that one day he would become a doctor. All he saw was this costume, and the things associated with it spoke to him or her. And inevitably, I would like to be that. I would like to act like that. I would like to experience that. And so it starts by putting the costume on. And I think that's what ultimately play and imitation, as we have been saying, that's what it does. It allows us to sample a future. And in sampling that future, I think it does come with some propositional knowledge. You know, doctors tend to wear these coats. Doctors tend to have these degrees. But then there's this experience you get on top of it, you know, which might be an experience of power, an experience of love, an experience of respect, an experience of humility. And these things we give words to, I think oftentimes are much bigger than what the squiggles on the paper can ever fully suggest. And so when I now start to look at where I'm at right now in my life, I think it's a matter of spirituality is allowing yourself to continue to sample, to continue to pursue, to act as if, you know, I would not say that I am someone who I would not call myself a meditator, but I've started to meditate more. I've sampled it. And what I'm finding is the density of periods where I do more and more of it in a period of time are increasing. And so in sampling it more often, I'm gaining more experience, more understanding from it. And so I'm acting as if I was committed to it like John Vervaeke in the moment that I am doing it. And only in time will I fully, as you said, become it. And so what is spirituality for me? It's constantly pursuing a path that gives you an emotional experience that you would put as positive, as right in your mind. And it's continuing to pursue it until you become it. So analogy provides us as humans utility to the degree that if we are unhappy, we have a mechanism, a bridge to go try different things that might actually be the greener pasture we know not yet that we want. And so let me pause there, but that's me pulling some of it out.
No, that was good. That was good. I mean, even etymologically, there's deep connections between spirituality and aspiration. They both have the breath metaphor in them, and the in and out, right? And so that connection, I mean, you made some, to my mind, some very deep connections between spirituality and aspiration, right? The spirituality is ultimately aspirationality, which I kind of like. I think that's a really cool way of even phrasing it. And then your point about embodiment, and I think why you were hammering at why it was an important point. Well, I'll propose to you that why you're doing that is because you're trying to counterbalance a tradition that has grown up of seeing spirituality, and you invoke the notion of the soul as something separable from the body, or even the rejection of the body. As you probably know, I'm a big fan of Neoplatonism. But one of the parts of Neoplatonism that I'm deeply, deeply critical of is that how it started that tradition. And it gets exacerbated in the Gnostics, that the material world is evil, and spirituality is about getting the soul back up into a completely incorporeal existence. And so I think why I'm proposing to you that perhaps why you wanted to really make that point so clear is because you're trying to portray a vision of spirituality that rejects the rejection of the body, if you'll allow me to use that double negative, and says, you know, we've got to put aside the rejection of the body as the primary metaphor for what you were then talking about later, which was the right? Self-transcendence, which is itself a metaphor. I'm going above myself. That's a metaphor, right? Right? And so we have, and so aspirational is about self-transcendence, right? You basically, we used to, you pretend until you make it, right? Until you're there. And so part of the challenge, I think, in terms of our historical context, is to really articulate and also beautify the notion of self-transcendence that is now completely separate from the idea of disembodiment or rejection of the body or rejection of the world. I mean, that was, for all of my criticisms of him, that's Nietzsche's project. He's trying to get, the notion of the Übermensch was a notion of self-transcendence that still made you a lover of the earth. You were still going to stay true to your embodiment and embedment. Because so I think that goes deep. I'll propose it to you, and then I'll let it go back to you. That attempt, and I'm with you in it. We're partners in it. That attempt to reinventio self-transcendence so that it's aspirational through enacted, embodied analogy. I think that is consonant with and participates in what I argue is the larger project of re-understanding, right, the legacy that we were given from the axial age without having the two worlds mythology anymore, because we did the same thing, to my mind. We thought of wisdom and meaning and realness, and see what my hands are doing, right, as that which could detach from, leave behind, right, the messy material embodied world. And I understand why that metaphor arose. It makes sense. But I think the metaphor, I think the metaphor is now moribund, and it's also malicious to some degree. I don't mean any evil intent, but it's deleterious. So you see what I'm trying to suggest? I think this cultural project of overcoming the metaphor of the two worlds from the axial revolution, and the way you articulated spirituality as somehow like making attractive again self-transcendence while keeping us embodied beings. I think those two projects are deeply interwoven.
I think, and I'm going to bring the movement back in for a moment.
Please.
Yeah, because we were going to bring up Rafe Kelly, and this might be the bridge. I won't call it a footnote. It might be a footnote, or it might be a critical piece to this. Why now do we find that this pursuit of spirituality, of aspiration, of a journey, of betterment? Yeah. Innately, I feel like that's a part of who we are, but why? And so and I have no data for this, you might, but let's go back before, the Industrial Revolution, before agriculture. What were we? We were hunter-gatherers. We were movers. We were nomads. Our life was in a literal perceiving, acting way. It was a literal journey. And every day our survival dependent on our ability to attend to the right things at the right time to make the best decisions, right? To keep our families safe, fed, clothed, so on and so forth. And so it wasn't metaphorical. The journey that we used to go on was quite literal. But over time, I believe that journey had to become metaphorical, because agriculture required us to stay in one place for long periods of time, then cities. And so now look at us. We're not even at a workplace right now, John. Now we're just at our home. It's become even more locked in. Yet, I do believe there's this grounded need for a journey. And I believe that grounded need for a journey means there are two core ingredients. Two core ingredients that we now as humans, we absolutely need as much as air, water, food, and love. And that is, we need to move. Movement has gone away from being part of what we do as a natural course of day to day,
Right.
as something we have to think about doing.
Right.
It's almost by analogy similar to, at one point I would just think about this cup of water and grab it. But now I actually have to think about my arm as it grabs the water. I have to think about moving. I have to think about using my body. But if we don't use this sensory motor machinery, it's almost like it starts to erode, and we know quite literally, physically, from the inside. And it has both physical and mental consequences. So it seems like we need to now bring in movement as a part of the solution, as a part of the journey that we now no longer go on in a literal sense, which would have had literal movement requirements. The other piece, though, is this pursuit of something, right? This ongoing pursuit of something.
Right.
This ongoing pursuit of something. And for me, that's now where this discussion becomes remarkably important. I don't know. I don't know if thousands of years ago, the conversation around self-development and growth mindset would have been as powerful. My sense is probably not. No doubt religion and spirituality was still part of it, but it seemed so connected, right, to the seasons, the physical journey. They were almost one. And so now the movement is gone, the physical journey is gone. So how do we get back the movement, the sensory motor journey? And then how do we get back the cognitive pursuit of something that depends on that physical journey? That's where I believe these things start to come together. And this is why the self-help industry is a multi-billion-dollar industry. They are all trying to do what we are trying to do on this call. And that is saying, what are the schemas, the heuristics, the mental models we can use to consistently put us on a cognitive path, a physical embodied path towards clarity, towards clearness, towards a connectedness with the world around us, with ourselves. And I'll pause there, but I believe it's those two elements. It's the movement part of the journey, and it's the pursuit itself that are now missing, that we are trying to bring back in with conversations like this.
That's really good, Nick. That's really good. Thank you for that. That's really, okay. So lots of stuff is sparking for me. And then I want to bring in something you had already brought up earlier, the mimesis, because I'm thinking of the shaman, and I'm thinking of the shaman, right, who, gestures and dance so that he can assume the identity of the animal that is being tracked so that he can pick up on the signs of it. I watched a video of this, right? And it's there's a bunch of hunter-gatherers, they're in Africa, and they're doing persistence hunting, right? Where you just keep tracking the animal until it basically heat strokes, right? And it looks like we evolved for that. That's why we could sweat off for a whole surface. So we're doing this for a very long time. And the thing about persistence hunting is tracking is crucial to it, right? In a way that it's not crucial for ambush hunting and other things. And they come to a place where the antelope has gone out of their field of vision, right? And they're trying to decide where to go. And so what does he do? He stops and he starts enacting the antelope, right? And he starts enacting it, and he does the mimesis, and he does this thing where he basically gets into the perspectival knowing, the agent arena relationship of the antelope, right? And he's dancing and moving, right? All right. And I'm going to go somewhere with this. That's very punny. I'm going to go somewhere with this. And then he goes, and he picks up the signs, and they track. Now, is he 100% right? No. But is that a really reliable skill that he's honed so that he can track, right? Yeah. And it's like, and so what I'm saying is you've got the movement, right? And you've got the pursuit, but what's often united them together is the mimesis. And right? Because you see what the mimesis does, it allows you to coordinate the move, because you're not just moving, you're, like you're saying, you're tracking. So let's say that what we're doing is tracking, then mimesis is going to be really valuable for us if we're trying to track something. And then what that brings in for me, the final connection is, and I argued this at the movement summit, that Rafe put together, that these two movements, I keep punning, the movement and the mindfulness movement are coming together, because I think we're trying to stitch back together, the mindfulness where we're learning how to get into a state of consciousness that puts us in the right mimetic relationship for aspiration, right? That we can then integrate with the movement.
Yeah. I didn't realize that I just made the same argument you made.
Yeah.
But no, we're saying the exact same thing. And that is that the physical stuff, right? And kind of, excuse me here, the mental stuff, they were connected.
Yeah.
They are connected in the physical persistent hunting that you're just outlining there. The reality is, though, the vast majority of humans can't reenact or engage in that, nor do they want to.
Yeah.
Yet we do understand that to stitch them back together, we still almost have this insatiable inner need for these ingredients. And that's why if I'm moving in a world, it brings me back to it. And if I'm learning how to pay attention to that world through mindfulness, I'm giving myself the ingredients, albeit separately, although I think they can still come together in mindful movement, that we got naturally as a matter of course, years ago, right? And obviously for those who are still hunter-gatherers. And let me just put a small footnote on the shaman and the enacted dance of the animal for possible naysayers, because we've all actually experienced that enacted dance. If you're wearing a hat, let's say a large hat, and you walk down a hallway with a doorway, what will you do? You will naturally nod down. That hat's not coming off your head. When you drive a car, you immediately have an expanded sense of where the edges of that car is. What that tells us is, it goes back to Gallagher's body schema.
Yeah.
We have this ability to tap in to the physical structures of our surrounding and extend our sensory motor experience into them. It's part of the imitation, and it's part of our ability to connect with the environment around us. This reinforces why movement, imitation, as I think if you have argued, play is so important as part of this ongoing process.
That's great. I think that's very helpful. I wanted to pick up then on one other thing that comes from this. I really like this point. I'm sorry, it's very pregnant for me about the hunter-gatherer pursuit as and we were hunter-gatherers for 99.9% of our history as a species.
Yes.
And so, because I'm thinking about the imitation, so that we can pick up the signs, so that we can track the mind, the non-human mind that is other than ours. And you think about how much this is taken up into religious behavior, right? So that what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to imitate Christ, so that I can, come into a proper relationship with this, right? Well, in some sense, he's supposed to be divine. So his mind is supposed to be like mine, but not like mine. Like the animal's mind. You see, what I'm doing with analogy here is like mine, but not mine. And I need the analogy in order to aspire, so that I can find the signs that will help me to come into the right relationship, track the mind that is like mine, but other than mine, so I can come to be with it. You see what I'm trying to do? I'm trying to say that.
I do, John. And I oftentimes, I feel I'm oversimplifying it. I'm going to say broadly religious, spiritual pursuits, but let me put it in the way that it still kind of resonates in my own mind. And that in my own life, I'm trying to paint a picture of the world I want to live in and the person I want to be in that world. Mm-hmm. And I recognize that I will never fully achieve it, but that's not the point.
Right.
The point is the pursuit of it.
Right.
I also reserve the right to change that future world I want to live in.
Yeah.
Material goods might have been important in that future world when I was 21. They've become far less important now,
Right.
at 36. And so I reserve the right to change the world I want to live in, as well as the individual I want to be within it. But the beauty is that that is a constant evolving space that I attend to, that I seek to empathize with it.
Yes. Yeah.
So I'm trying to empathize. I'm trying to bring about the emotional state of the person I want to be. I want to think like the person I want to be, with the hopes that in doing that, I will co-create the world that I want to live in. And in many ways, I haven't said this yet, in many ways, empathy, and Lakoff and Johnson argue this, empathy is a form of metaphor, and that I try to bring you into me.
Yes.
Or
Yes.
me into you.
Yeah.
And so in many ways, we use empathy to understand and to bring about future states. And so for me, what is spirituality? It's the constant endeavor to paint the world and the person I want to be in that world. The key word there is to be in that world. And then that by its very nature becomes the source analogy, and I am the target.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
self,
Oh, that's great.
I'm trying to map that onto me. And then through that map, I'm having these bridges that say, you know what? I'm going to cook that meal on Thanksgiving for our friends who are in the hospital. And maybe the person I wanted to be last year would not have done that. But now the person I want to be now, he's the kind of person that does those things. You see what I'm saying here?
Yeah. Yeah.
For me, that is enacted spirituality. I am starting to ritualize a behavior that is part of the person I want to become. And so I could be wrong. I don't think I can be wrong in this case, because I think this has to be an individual journey. But for me, that's what it is. It's setting up the world and the person I want to be, recognizing that that will continue to evolve. But either way, I'm constantly using that as a reference point to bridge to where I am, such that each step I take is in pursuit of a better version of a better world that I define and no others.
That's really good. That insight you had about, right? Although I'm in some sense, like now I'm creating the image, it nevertheless becomes the source that gets mapped onto me as a target. And that's brilliant. I really like that. And so you sort of said you've got, it's like evolving empathetic, symbolic aspiration. That's what, because you're creating a symbolon. You're trying to create a connection. You're trying to join something. You and the not you, but it's like you, but it's not you, right? Like the sage is basically an enacted, internalizable metaphor. That's really, really cool. I like that idea. So yeah, evolving.
Can I brighten that just a second? Because we talk about our ability to time travel mentally, right? Past, present, future. And earlier in this discussion, we talked about an analogy as a collaboration with the past self.
Right.
I also believe then that spirituality is collaboration with the future self. Right. And the older I get, and the more reference points I have and more experiences I have, the clearer I can project into the future, the realm of possibility, and the more the analogy can actually get in front of me versus me always looking back.
That's wonderful. Yeah.
And that's what I feel day in, day out is happening. I'm able to better project. I know I'm not there. That's not the point. The point is to give me some kind of direction. And I think conventionally I would have traditionally called that God, and I would have called it the doctrine of that God. And that's okay. And for many people, that is a great path forward. Beautiful. For me, I've fallen from that, so I need to replace that with something, because I do believe it's a human need that goes back to the journey that I believe is embedded to the hunter-gatherer. And only now am I starting to think of it like that. So, people listening, like, there's no one way to do that. But are you taking the time to look forward and simply ask yourself, what world do I want to live in? But more importantly, how do I want to be in that world? And then simply ask yourself, through what steps can I take today to empathize and thus bring on board that future self and become 1% closer?
And that the way in which we enhance the way in which we enhance the evolving empathy is through enacted analogy. That's
Yes.
a pivot point in the argument, right?
Yes. We act as if we are that person. And again, it goes right back 1 hour after birth. Sean Gallagher, imitation.
Yeah, yeah.
We can bring that future into existence by acting as if, one step at a time. And, this is why I think movies and books like The Secret are so attractive. But John, you and I both know there's nothing secret about The Secret.
Yeah.
It is simply being able to project forward and inhabit that future self, right? And having the discipline, the love, the desire to do that. And, that's all anyone can do.
Do you think that things like The Secret represent something that we were criticizing earlier? Just to bring what I mean is they're taking something that's an aspirational, enacted, right, analogy in order to enhance the evolving empathy. I like this way of putting it. And they're turning it into a literal otherworldly force.
Yes.
Right? And thereby they're getting caught up in a propositional meaning as opposed to seeing through it to activate all the perspectival participatory knowing.
But that's why it's attractive to people. And
it's attractive. Yeah,
attractive, but it's the wrong. I believe I agree with you.
Yeah.
It actually undermines the paths that are available to you to actually pursue what The Secret is suggesting it'll help you pursue and achieve.
Right.
It is blinding you from what is available to you ultimately. Yes. But what we're talking about here takes work. As I've heard you articulate many times, wisdom in its core traditions was not what you said or what you knew, it's what you did.
Yeah.
And that's why I love that you always talk about enacted analogy. Act your way into better behavior. You can't think your way into better behavior. So act as you want to be and you will become. I think that is, if you were to put a tagline to what we're trying to say here around, enacted analogy, that's what it's about. Yes. Sample the futures that are available to you and act as if. The first day I meditate, I cannot say that I am a meditator. I cannot say that I am in any way enlightened, but I am one step closer. And maybe that's why this is so, talking in this way is natural to me, because I come from a world of training. We understand that everything we get, we have to earn through remarkably hard incremental work that doesn't always work out, yet we keep pursuing. And so I see that being on par with the human struggle. People want the easy way, and that's normal. That's in our hardware. But I think once we recognize that there is no easy way, that's when the work can really begin, and that's when the relief and the access can really begin.
Yeah. This is a very powerful vision of spirituality that you're articulating.
It's the only one I know.
Well, I mean, it sort of has to be, I think, if it's going to be spirituality. If it doesn't grab you, by your guts, then it's just stuff you're sort of dabbling in. So what do you think are the primary obstacles we're facing right now? You've articulated an embodied, empathetic spirituality, as opposed to a disembodied, I don't know what to call it, magical spirituality. What are the primary obstacles to getting people to take this on board?
Number one, for me, I could be wrong here, is self-acceptance. If it is the self, you as a person that ultimately wants to become, that can't start to become that, that oneness can't change, can't become something else until you've accepted it. And so, I think everybody in their own way, maybe not everybody, many, myself definitely, spends the first part of their journey coming into contact with themselves and trying to understand who you are and what you stand for and what you believe in, and accepting that fully. Only then, I believe, can we start to begin the journey of, well, to go on the journey, wherever that journey might take you. But you have to be able to become the person that you are, versus so often we sit in this third person. We sit separate from ourselves, even in the way we talk about, first person, second person, thinking fast, thinking slow. These are interesting scientific principles, but cognitively, as the phenomenological experience of first person, they can be troublesome. They can start to separate the mind and the body. So I think it is about self-acceptance. And I think some of the work by research like Brene Brown, I think many of her messaging around surrendering to the self, the importance of vulnerability are critical. I think these are our biggest barriers, John, if I'm completely honest. And then from there, it's the tools of pursuing a better version of yourself. How do you do that? Well, that's probably for another conversation, but I do believe these mental models, what do you call them? The
technologies.
Psychotechnologies. These are critical. Even you giving me that word in one of your first lectures, psychotechnology, immediately allowed me to grab on to the different ways I can think better and the different tools at my disposal. So once you accept yourself and you're ready to go on that journey with yourself as yourself, rather than third person, first person fighting against one another, then it's recognizing the psychotechnologies available to you to go on that journey. And it's supporting then that journey with the ingredients that we need. We need to be able to move, so movement. We need to be able to think, so clarity and quality of attention, mindfulness. Mm-hmm. So I think we have some physical practices we can engage in that support these psychotechnologies once we have gone through some level of self-acceptance. And I'll be honest, I think self-acceptance is the first few chapters in everyone's journey. And again, these tools and psychotechnologies can assist you with. But I would certainly say I am in the mix of people trying to figure this out.
That's very helpful. So if I can ask you some, so now you're sounding very Socratic to my ear. And okay. So maybe I should ask some Socratic questions. So you're proposing self-acceptance, and I hear what you're saying. So can you clarify it by telling me how it's distinct from these two other things? People are, of course, enormously fascinated with themselves and their biographies, yes. Right? And we have a culture that just reinforces that all the time, right? And I assume, because from the tenor of what you're saying, you don't mean that when you say self-acceptance. You don't mean celebrating your biography and all that sort of thing. The other thing is, and this was part of the problem with the self-esteem movement, and we've got enough good empirical data now to tell us that was a mistake. That was a cultural experiment that we got wrong, where what we want is we want people to have self-esteem, and we want them to be satisfied with themselves. Because it sounds very much to me like you're not proposing self-satisfaction either. So here's my question. How does self-acceptance differ from self-celebration or self-aggrandizement or self-sufficiency? What do you mean there? Do you understand the question I'm asking?
I think I do. For me, the first thing I would say is, as I use self-acceptance purely from the standpoint of a non-judgmental perspective. So to the degree that I am, right? I am something at a given moment. It's my ability to accept that, for better or for worse. And in doing so, it allows me, as objectively as I can, to see where I'm at, accept that wholeheartedly, and then say, what elements would I like to pursue? What aspects, what avenues would I like to take? I said to my wife very early in our relationship that the following resonated with me. I'm not what I am. I'm not what I am. And what that means is, for me, it means what I am is constantly evolving. I think that's the whole idea of the journey. But for that evolution to take place, I believe at any given moment, I have to be willing to accept myself wholeheartedly, for better or for worse. And in doing so, only through that lens will, I think, my journey net out an experience that I would call positive, worthwhile, fulfilling, satisfactory.
So to my ear, then, that the self-acceptance sounds like the Socratic virtues of humility and self-knowledge.
Yes.
Knowing
non-judgment. Yes.
Yeah. Yes. So it's again, it's not your biographical self-knowledge, although your biography might provide useful material. It's more like, what did you call the body schema? Like the operating manual, the operating system. Yeah. It's getting a knowledge, an appropriate, not inflated or deflated, but well-calibrated knowledge of your operating system. Is it something like that?
I think so. I mean, for me, to go on a journey, I have to have a general sense of where I am.
Yep.
I have to have a general sense of where I want to go, and recognizing that the path to get there, there are probably many paths to get there. But I need these two data points. I need to have a general, albeit foggy, sense of where I'm going and where I'm at today. So when I say self-acceptance, and I might be using the wrong words.
No, that's fine.
But what I'm trying to get at is, how do I get at where I am today?
Right.
And how do I do that without bullshitting myself, that this is where I'm at today?
Yeah.
Accepting that, because only in doing that can I then begin my journey forward. Because if here's where I'm at, but I'm bullshitting myself and saying I'm over here, I can never go there, because this is my starting point, yet I think I'm over here in the matrix.
Yeah.
So that's, whatever we call that, that is what I believe is step one. You have to be able to say, this is my starting point, fully accepted, non-judgmental. Here's where I'm at. I have an idea of where I want to go. We're kind of putting that in the context of spiritual realization and everything that goes along with that. Once I have those two data points, knowing that this one evolves every moment, and spiritually and where I want to be and the world I want to be in, that's fine. But as long as I have those two data points in check, I can then continue to navigate between them.
So it sounds like then it's like, the hunter-gatherer has to adopt the right identity, even in play, in pretense, in order to afford the journey.
Yes.
And it's kind of, that's where you need to get your sense of who and what you are, so that it affords you adopting in play the future that you're moving towards. Is that it?
That's it. It's as you talk about, it's, if anything, it's the reduction of self-delusion.
Yeah.
It is the reduction of self-bullshitting. It is understanding where you are actually at.
Yeah.
And we know that there are many layers to unpacking that. Yeah.
Right. So that does sound very much like Socratic self-knowledge to me, because it's that simultaneous process of not bullshitting yourself so you can get into where you are at, to use your language, such that it affords you aspiring to where you want to be.
Absolutely. In my mind, and I'd love your take here. We talk about anxiety in sport. We talk about anxiety in life, and I think that's part of so much of what we refer to as suffering. I believe, if we were to get, is this sense of chronic, non-specific anxiety. In a way, I'd love your take on it. I believe anxiety is the space between what you think you're capable of and what you think is being asked of you.
Okay, this is brilliant, because this is Tillich. Okay, so Tillich distinguishes between psychological anxiety, and he doesn't mean that they can't be found together. Okay, This is an analytic distinction, which you'll often call something more like fear, because he wants to indicate, like, you've got this state and there's something you're afraid of. And then what he calls existential anxiety, and this is how he describes it. Existential anxiety is when there's a disconnect between your existential self, how you are existing, right, and your essential self. He uses the word essential, and he says the essential self is always in front of us, right, drawing us forward. Now, that language might be problematic today, but what he's trying to get at is, he's trying to get at the Socratic point of your existential knowledge, not your self-aggrandizing autobiography, nor all of your narcissistic ways in which you're great and wonderful or unique. He said, you want to cut, because you only get what you have to do is you have to be in this, you have to get to, as you put it really well, where you are here now. That's your existential self. And then anxiety is when there is a disconnect, when it is not being drawn toward what he calls your essential self, and he means by that your aspirational self. The self that would be the self that could say that it is, well, the Stoics, right? The self that would be in a place where, this sounds morbid, but it's not meant to be, where you could say, I could die now.
Yes. So
right?
that resonates heavily with me.
Yeah.
That is the self I pursue on a daily basis.
Yeah.
One that is content, that I've acted and operated in a way where if it was to end, and I was alive to tell you how I felt at the end, would be okay.
Yeah.
100%. And so this is where, for me, the reduction of the suffering, the reduction of the anxiety comes in that alignment. I think we spend, and I love that idea of the disconnect. I think you have people that spend a lot of time in the future, which can be very problematic because they're going nowhere and they're creating this unbelievable mind map of what they want. Yet every day when they go back to reality, they realize that that vision, as it becomes clear, gets farther away. That gap almost creates more suffering and anxiety.
There's empirical evidence for this. People who have these rich fantasy lives about themselves actually are much, much more prone to depression.
And so this is where it's those two things. It's getting a grip on where you're at. It's pursuing that future, which should be, I like that idea of the essential self, that the self that you want to die with. I think is it's not morbid. I think that's actually a beautiful idea. And then ultimately, it's recognizing that a lot of the utility and the need for these phenomenological qualities, these experiences, were they were invisible to us because they were part and parcel to our hunter-gatherer forebears. So now we have to make the invisible visible. This is why exercise is tough. Diet is tough. Mindfulness, meditation is tough. These are things that we now have to take cognitive control over that in the past were tacit. They were literally part and parcel to the environment. But I believe there is liberation in the recognition of that. Because now we recognize the ingredients, the elements that were once there, that fulfilled us, that are now gone, but yet are still available to us. And bring those in: movement, mindfulness, and through those mechanisms, getting a grip on where we're at, continuing to evolve the essential future self, and we take it one day at a time. And as I say, all the people that I work with, how do you get better? One step at a time. It's not a cliche. It is true. Do you do something every day to pursue the essential self? And if you're stacking those together, inevitably you'll wake up and you'll be there.
That's wonderful. That's wonderful. Well, this is actually a good closure point for the conversation, I think. So maybe we could come back next time when we're together, and because we were talking very individualistic here, and that's appropriate. But of course, another part of spirituality, and it goes back to the hunter-gatherer, is working in a group, like and getting that communitas, and getting that sense of being at one with others. And I'm sure you also have important things to say about that, because that is also, no doubt, you've had. That's an aspect of your coaching I haven't heard too much about, but I imagine that there's an aspect of that there too, where So maybe we could call that, part 2 of the discussion about what does that look like, and how does your reflection and your experience from the world of coaching give us some understanding again of how we can exact that Paleolithic machinery into the scientific age, and we can get an even fuller picture of what we're meaning by human spirituality here. So I invite you to come back and we can have that discussion.
I look forward to it, John.
Okay. Thank you very much.